it's a fundamental problem. It's a situation which will not hold.
That story is coming up in just a moment. This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. Is China gearing up to take on a more confrontational role in the South China Sea? Seoul prepares for what may be a massive anti-government rally this weekend. If Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't help the Rohingyas in Myanmar, does that taint her victory? Plus, one Japanese company is using trees to make noodles, attacks in Bangladesh continue, and more are coming up on the December 4th edition of Asia News Weekly. Greetings and salutations, my excellent friend. Steve Miller here. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join me today on the website or by downloading the podcast in your favorite application. Let's go ahead and get things kicked off this week once more with news from the South China Sea. With its 9-dash line, China has claimed virtually all of the South China Sea as their own. We've seen their slow and steady buildup of bases for more than a year now, and as the United States announces it will once more sail inside the 12 nautical miles Beijing likes to claim as their own around these features, China unveiled a restructuring of its military forces. To help understand why that may be, Mark Cozad, Senior International Defense Policy Analyst with the RAND Corporation, returns to the podcast. I started off our conversation by asking him if such a restructuring was out of the ordinary.
It really is something out of the ordinary. The last time you had anything of this magnitude really goes back to the late 80s. You have a lot of the PLA literature that's coming out surrounding the conference last week, the CMC conference last week, saying that this is the largest type of reorganization since the founding of the PRC. You know, if you really go back to the 1980s, they cut down the military regions from 11 to 7. Did a lot of other reorganization, cut out large numbers of forces, and over the next several years, there was this reorientation of Chinese strategic focus from the northern border down to the southeast region, a change in strategic direction that came about in 1993. So this type of thing has happened before. What you're seeing now, though, is significant because it really hasn't happened to any type of extent like it did in the 1980s since that time. And this is something really that's very long overdue. Over the past 15 or so years, there have been a lot of discussion about trying to reorganize, trying to put into place some of these reforms, but they really haven't stuck. And so a lot of the things that they're talking about right now are very important in terms of making the PLA more operationally responsive, making it more efficient in the way that it looks at its future requirements and manages its manpower, and then also giving it some institutional structure. And one of the key things that they've talked about in the post-conference write-ups about the reforms, one of them has been internal legal reform and legal structuring, and in particular looking at areas that deal with corruption, look at military legal system, military laws, and then also civil-military relations. So this really is a very comprehensive type of reform. The big question is now that it's been set, will implementation be successful? And I think that's really one of the major sticking points that the PLA's had over the past 15 to 20 years with reforms.
One of the things we've often talked about with President Xi is how he's consolidated power. Is this consolidation of the military in line with that as well?
I think it is, but I also think it's a product of his ability to shore up power at the beginning of his term. One of the reasons why these reforms were so difficult under Hu was that Hu had a pretty rocky relationship with the military. And as a lot of people recall, really the big push from Hu is looking at new historic missions. And in many respects, those were fairly ill-defined. And they really focused on things that many in the PLA believed were getting away from really developing more fighting capabilities. When Xi came in, one of the first things that he did was put out the idea that the PLA needed to be preparing to fight and win wars under the current conditions, which focus on informatization, fighting against modern adversaries, and being able to project power. And so as he shored up his power, one of the really key things is that this enabled him to do the reforms that Hu was not able to do. Previous reforms, there had been manpower reductions. They created an NCO Corps. There were reforms within individual institutions that focused on procurement and the development of equipment requirements over the long term. But again, these were not really comprehensive and felt across the PLA in more that really institutional, cultural sort of a sense as these appear to be laid out in this latest round of reforms. And notably, a lot of the discussion about the reduction of the military regions and turning them into theaters, that has been a discussion that's been going on for quite some time. That's really not a new thing. It reemerged under Xi. It had been discussed under Hu, and really it didn't go anywhere under Hu. So again, I think that a major part of this is enabled by his ability to shore up power. Now, I also think that when you go through and you look at the reforms, I think that part in reforming the military legal system, and particularly the focus on corruption and abuse of authority, those are extremely important, as well as the civil-military emphasis. And the civil-military emphasis, I think, is important because one of the things that gets to is the parties and the military's competence in managing civil-military relations in a transition from peacetime to wartime. And that's one of the things, if you go back and you look at the development of the National Defense Mobilization Law, which took about 15 years to finally get approved, that's one of the major issues that they've been wrestling within that law, and really trying to put in place a legal framework, really trying to put in place a means where the PLA and the party could go and get these really important capabilities, whether they're transportation related, communications related, technology related, personnel related, be able to go and get those from outside of the PLA and not have to maintain them in the ways that they had in previous years. So in a lot of respects, I think that this really goes, both in relationship to his ability to shore up his power, but I think this is further going to consolidate his power, particularly as it plays with the PLA. One interesting point about that a couple of media outlets have picked up on is the fact that you did see a good bit of discussion, particularly following the piece that came out from those two NDU professors that talked about the potential for social instability coming up from the reduction of pay and pensions for military officers and the mobilization of 300,000. There has been a lot of discussion about ensuring that the party committees within each of the organizations really puts out the correct thinking about these reforms and what they're meant to do. So it's something that I think that the party leadership and the military leadership really understands could be dangerous, but they're very proactively taking moves to try to make sure that doesn't happen.
If we switch gears just a little bit, the Philippines wrapped up its case against China in the International Court of Arbitration. China still doesn't recognize the court's jurisdiction in this matter, and I wanted to get your opinion. Do you think that with these changes to be kind of more streamlined in its responses, do you think that Beijing or Xi will simply ignore any portions of the ruling that go against China and continue along its present course in the South China Sea?
I think over time it's going to be very hard for them to ignore it, and especially as President Merkel's recent statements about the importance of the international courts, and particularly as they relate to the South China Sea and the Philippines case, it is more of that international sentiment evolves. It's going to be much more difficult for China to ignore any sort of ruling that comes out from The Hague. I think that they were hoping that in this first round, The Hague was not going to take it on, that it was outside of their jurisdiction, and that there'd be a ruling that came back on that. But with that going out the window, I think I think China is going to really have to seriously think about what its strategy is going to be moving forward, particularly in a case where The Hague may rule partially or totally in Philippines' favor. It sets a very bad precedent for them, and it also sets up a recognition that this is not understood to be Chinese sovereign territory. it recognizes the fact that by listening to the case that this is a territorial dispute. And so I think over the intervening period, the Chinese leadership is going to devote a lot of time thinking about what that response is going to be. It's going to be very difficult for them to just walk away and ignore, which is what's so problematic about the ruling.
All right, Mark Cozad is a senior international defense policy analyst with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
Okay, it's your turn to play armchair quarterback. What do you think we'll see next from China? Coming up on the podcast, Japan ignores that international ban on whaling. As I've previously mentioned on the podcast, November 14th was the date when over 60,000 people from various groups assembled at Seoul's City Hall with the intention to march on the president's residence and demand her resignation. Many feel she's reversing South Korea's democratic course, returning the country to authoritarian rule and not acting in the best interest of the nation. Things even got a little violent, with protesters throwing objects, and then the police responded by using water cannons and injuring a few, including one elderly farmer that to this date remains in critical condition. When the dust had settled from the protest, 51 people had been arrested, and the president vowed to crack down even harder on illegal gatherings, even going as far as to try and make a connection between protesters wearing masks and the terrorists of the Islamic State. So it came as no surprise when South Korea's Justice Minister Kim Hyung-un said the government was determined to eradicate any public disorder and stressed that violators would pay the price. Authorities raided the Suwon offices of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, presumably to dig up dirt on two of its members, stemming from the May 1st Seoul rallies. But the message was clear. The government was going to take a harsher stance against the organization and anyone who dares oppose it. Police told organizers last week that their planned December 5th protest rally was a no-go, and as one might expect, they took that notice and then chucked it. The group said they will still move forward with their protest and seek a court-ordered injunction against the ban. In a released statement, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions said, quote, "Police are denying the constitutional right to the freedom of protest rallies, and it's tantamount to the self-acknowledgement that the current government is a dictatorship." End quote. Originally, it was suspected that the December 5th gathering would only garner about 10,000 people. But in the wake of Pak's request to use stronger measures to strike down violent protests and the police ban, that may actually stir up more opposition and drive more to assemble at City Hall. And the group is right to challenge the government's stance that they can prohibit peaceful assembly of citizens. After all, the Lawyers for a Democratic Society notes the Constitution allows for assembly on the condition of prior notification and does not give the government power to ban gatherings. However, the Assembly and Demonstration Act does allow the banning of assemblies or demonstrations that clearly pose a direct threat to public peace and order from collective violence, intimidation, damage, or arson. And the key phrase to lock in on this provision is direct and clear. But since there are no criteria listed as to what kinds of situations meet that test, in the end, the police, or rather the government, has the final say on who may and may not assemble. To this end, some are exploring ways to ensure that if a protest does take place on the 5th, that it is peaceful. They're recommending placing flowers on vehicle barricades and using satirical or even comical masks to deflate tension. But given what has transpired in the past 2 weeks, some may be still itching for a fight. Hopefully that won't be the case, and cooler heads will prevail. But rest assured, tensions are high, and both sides desperately want to appear to have come out on top. And later in the podcast, will Aung San Suu Kyi's new government do enough to help the plight of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar? Despite the International Court of Justice ruling last March that Japan's whaling program in the Antarctic should cease, the East Asian archipelago announced its plans to resume the practice. The Japanese fisheries agencies notified the International Whaling Commission that it will resume whaling in the 2015-2016 season under a revised plan. The new program cuts the numbers of whales slaughtered to just 333, two-thirds of the number that the previous program had. It is a number that the Japanese agency feels is scientifically reasonable. Tokyo maintains the animals are not endangered, and since eating whale is part of the nation's food culture, the practice should be allowed to continue. Australia and environmental groups immediately chimed in and denounced the plan. In fact, Australia's Environment Minister, Greg Hunt, was quoted as saying that Japan cannot unilaterally decide to start whaling against a ruling of the International Court of Justice and against the advice of scientists. Now, no one really is against the practice of hunting or killing animals for food. Everyone does it. After all, where do those Big Macs, strips of bacon, or chicken nuggets come from? We need meat, and that comes from animals. But if you're going to slaughter an animal for consumption, you need to do it within the confines of the law. Japan is now stepping outside that boundary, and that is a real problem. The courts in The Hague were put in place to essentially get countries to behave responsibly and to hold one another accountable. Tokyo is now tossing that notion aside and doing what it wants, and essentially proving that the body has no power. If we extend this particular scenario to other instances, we will see where things get sticky. Japan has challenged South Korea in the past to take their dispute over Dokdo or Takashima to the International Court of Justice for resolution. But really, why would Seoul ever consider doing that, since Tokyo now has demonstrated it won't follow rulings? On a grander scheme, and the real reason why this case is so important, China and the Philippines are engaged in hearings that have a direct impact on the fate of the South China Sea. China already doesn't buy into the notion that the court has jurisdiction. So if the court can't reel in Japan's rogue behavior, then what hope does it have to curtail China's activity? None. Coming up in the Asia Brief, the Islamic State continues to make inroads into Bangladesh, gang rapes in India, and more regional news. The story of Myanmar's Aung San Suu Kyi is amazing. After she led the party to victory in 1990, the powers that be voided that election and sentenced her to house arrest for more than a decade before finally granting her freedom in 2010. During that time, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991 and became a voice for the people. It's no wonder that as times changed, and under her leadership, the National League for Democracy, or the NLD, soared in popularity and easily won this past November's election. But all is not rosy in the country. Suu Kyi said in a recent interview, quote, "Our party has won an overwhelming majority of the seats, but we won't take them all. We will cooperate with others with the spirit of sharing our success with them based on building national reconciliation. Of course, the NLD will lead. It is the mandate the people have given us at our request. We will include ethnic representatives who are not NLD members and others who can benefit the country." End quote. But for all the talk of a positive future, there's been little discussion of Rohingya Muslims, whose rights in their own country are lacking.
Well, currently the situation has not changed in any appreciable way from before the election.
Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division.
We're still facing a situation where the Rohingya are displaced from their original homes. Over 140,000 of them are living in internally displaced persons camps, where they're completely reliant on the international community for things like food and medical support. And unfortunately, those things are not being provided in ample enough quantity. I mean, what we're seeing is Rohingya who don't have access to education. They're facing diseases or sicknesses that would be eminently treatable. They're not able to move out of those camps because those camps are surrounded by security forces and also by hostile Rakhine groups that would be prepared to attack Rohingya who leave the area. So, it's really a community that has been locked down. It is almost like a quasi-apartheid situation where, the Rakhine control the cities and the areas where trade and commerce takes place, and out in the Rohingya Bantustans, these IDP camps, these people are essentially housed in UNHCR tents with very little access to livelihoods or other services. It's a fundamental problem. It's a situation which will not hold.
This week, Suu Kyi met with the current president and military chief earlier than expected and behind closed doors, the hope being that these discussions would lead to a peaceful and smooth transition of power from the old guard to the NLD and to ensure that those in the past would not be blamed for any past transgressions. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that Suu Kyi is the right person to lead Myanmar and to make a positive difference. But if she doesn't address the plight of Rohingyas, does that lessen her victory?
Well, I don't think it lessens the victory. It just shows that there's a lack of inclusion and understanding about the importance of the Rohingya as a symbolic issue to the international community. This is a failure by the National League for Democracy to understand that a system of citizenship that is defined by ethnic race is not viable. This completely goes against the international human rights standards, but that's what the Citizenship Act of 1982 is all about. It basically designates that there's 135 recognized races of Burma, and that if you're one of those races, you have citizenship. If you're not, you don't. And so, Rohingya are not recognized. But also, so ethnic Chinese are not recognized, ethnic Indians are not recognized. Gurkhas, there's communities of Gurkhas from Nepal who have lived in Burma for generations. They're not recognized. So, unless the new government, which we presume will be led by the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, recognize that there needs to be a fundamental revamp of the way Burma constitutes citizenship, we're going to face ongoing problems of the sort that we're seeing with the Rohingya today, which is exclusion, which is a policy of not recognizing, at this point, almost 1 million people and identifying them as essentially persons who are not from Burma, despite the fact that many of these people have lived in Burma for generations and under international law, even if they're considered stateless, would have to be considered as citizens of Burma.
So what do you think? Rohingyas are stateless in their own homeland. They couldn't even vote in this monumental election. If true change is to occur in the country, it must happen for everyone. The question, of course, remains if Suu Kyi can actually politically push through those changes that would improve the situation of the Rohingyas. But if no attempt is made, then what does that really say about her? On the next Asia Now podcast, dropping December 8th, you'll get the audio version of this month's What's Up Asia, the monthly water cooler news discussion program featuring Hiko Simon over in Japan. Despite how many times Bangladeshi authorities try to ignore it, that country certainly does appear to have an Islamic State problem. The nation has seen a rash of murders in recent months, with 4 secular bloggers being killed, the murders carried out against Italian and Japanese foreign nationals, and now an attack on a Shiite mosque in the northern region of the country. Police like to say that the terrorist group has no foothold in the country, preferring to lay blame on the Jamaat-ul Mujahideen Bangladesh, or JMB, which police shot and killed one of the group's commanders last week during a bomb attack and police raid. Unidentified gunmen on November 26 opened fire on worshippers inside the mosque in the Bogra district during evening prayers. Arafur Rahman Mandal, additional superintendent of police in Bogra, told the Voice of America The gunmen entered the mosque before launching the gun attacks. 4 with gunshot injuries were immediately taken to a local hospital, where one, the Muja Zen, died later. Police have launched a nationwide dragnet in an attempt to bring the perpetrators to justice and have reportedly detained some individuals already for questioning. Roughly 96% of Bangladesh's Muslims are Sunni. Imran H. Sarkar, a local social activist, said, quote, "Most of the Muslims participating in the Shia or Shiite Muharram celebrations are Sunni. We have never seen any enmity between the two Muslim sects in Bangladesh. The bomb attack on the Muharram procession in Muslim-majority Bangladesh came as a surprise to us." End quote. Bilal Hussain, a Shiite community leader in New Delhi, said, quote, "IS is trying to set the Sunnis in Bangladesh against the Shias. The group is an enemy of Islam." End quote. And that is 100% true. I can't make it any clearer than that. The Islamic State is not part of Islam. Heads of state must simply do more to eradicate this threat. But it can't just end there. We must all rise up and do our part. Gao Yu had been sentenced to prison for 7 years for releasing state secrets to foreign media. When she appealed that decision recently, the court said no, but did lessen her time by 2 years. However, it does appear that the powers that be have decided to release her on medical parole, as her health has been steadily worsening. Her brother, Gao Wei, had hoped that the court would have overturned her conviction, but at least she is out and can get better treatment than inside the jail. However, with Gao out, China opted to sentence 3 more human rights activists to harsh prison terms for participating in an anti-censorship protest in 2013. While the court's decision isn't surprising, it wasn't without controversy. According to the lawyer for Gu Fei Shuang, a criminal charge was added to his case moments before the trial began. In speaking with the Voice of America, the lawyer said, quote, "The way the court has unilaterally imposed criminal charges on the defendant is unheard of. It's shocking, horrifying." End quote. Luo Yuandong and Sung Desheng were sentenced to 3 years and 2.5 years respectively, while Gu got 6 years. The 3 were charged with gathering crowds to disturb social order, and Gu received an additional charge of picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Both of those charges are often used broadly against dissidents. Just what was the trouble they were accused of? Participating in a week-long peaceful demonstration back in 2013 outside the headquarters of the Southern Weekly newspaper. The demonstrators called on Beijing to give up censorship practices that affected the newspaper. Zhang Lei, the lawyer, plans on filing appeals. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have decried the rulings and called for the trio's release. But let's face it, Xi does what he wants, and when it comes to those who threaten his control, these 3 aren't going to be released anytime soon, unless, like in the case of Gao Yu, it becomes medically necessary. And now, let's take a closer look at the region with a few more headlines. When Mr. Ma and Mr. Xi met, it was a historic meeting between the 2 Chinese presidents. One of the apparent deals struck leading up to that meeting was a release of convicted spies. China let 2 go, and Taiwan let 1. The releases had been kept secret, but after the China Times announced them, Taiwan did so as well, calling the paper's actions inappropriate. The 2 nations periodically do make these exchanges, and according to the Times, China hopes to get 1 more spy back from Taiwan to even things out. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation is citing several unidentified sources and saying that a massive cyber breach was perpetrated against the nation's Bureau of Meteorology. The report says the hack may have compromised potentially sensitive national security information. The Bureau and police have been keeping mum on the alleged attack, but one source puts the blame squarely on China. Beijing says the accusations are groundless and that it is opposed to cyber attacks. Unfortunately for China, it has done little to convince the world otherwise. Lance Corporal Joseph Scott Pemberton was found guilty of homicide for killing Jennifer Laud after he found out that she was a transgendered woman. The murder, which occurred last year in the Philippines, has put a strain on U.S.-Filipino relations as the Navy frequents the area. Pemberton will be sentenced between 6 and 12 years for committing the crime and has been ordered to pay about $100,000 in damages to Laud's family. It should be noted that the family was hoping for a murder conviction. In this instance, the conviction of homicide is a lesser crime than that of murder. Murder carries a maximum sentence of 40 years in prison. Anastasia Lin is the Canadian representative for the Ms. World pageant slated to take place in Sanya, China on December 19th. However, the Chinese government has labeled her persona non grata and refused to allow her entry into the country to compete. It appears Beijing is not too pleased that Ms. Lin has been using her position to speak out against human rights violations in China and specifically religious persecution, since she is a member of the Falun Gong. Rather than portraying an act of strength, barring Lin demonstrates China's weakness. Indian authorities have detained 4 high school students suspected of raping a younger girl. The gang rape occurred nearly a month ago, and authorities were made aware of it by the young woman's aunt. The 15-year-old victim had kept quiet about the incident after receiving threats from her attackers. The attackers are 16 and 17 years old and have confessed to the crime and have been sent to a juvenile correction facility. Where India goes from here will be closely watched, as a teenager who was convicted of gang rape on board a bus in New Delhi is about to be released. The nation has stiffened its penalties for rape, but will it be enough? Takashi Uemura is a name many might not recognize, but he plays a very important role in South Korean-Japanese relations. In 1991, when working for the Asahi Shimbun, he was the first Japanese reporter to recount the horrific tales of comfort women. Since that time, he's been a victim of harassment from Japan's right wing, and that stigma followed him to Hokusei Gakuen University, where he began teaching in 2012. It's now been announced that Uemura will cross the body of water that shall be named and teach at the Catholic University of Korea starting next year, as the two schools have an exchange program in place. And one more story just because I think it's cool. The Omi Kenshi Company is a textile company. Now, it has been in operation for nearly a century, but is facing stiffer competition. And they're looking to expand their business, going in new directions. So what are they going to do? Well, they're not going to expand into more diverse fashion lines, but rather they're going to get into the health food business. So check this out. The company plans to use indigestible cellulose, and rather than making rayon, they're going to mix it with konjac, a yam-like plant. The result? A fiber-rich flour, which the company calls Cell Eat. It contains no gluten, fat, and is almost completely carbohydrate-free. It's also very easy on the waistline at just 60 calories a kilogram, compared to that of 3,680 for wheat. Here we are once more at the end of the podcast, but before I go, let's take a quick look at some of your comments. Now, on the news that the South Korean government was going to take Volkswagen to task and fine the auto manufacturer over $12 million for falsifying emissions data, I asked if the ministry, who said they were going to investigate other auto manufacturers, I asked if they would be equally tough on domestic car makers. Kenny Dunlap said, "Doubt it, especially since the government is in their pocket. $12.3 million isn't that much, but in Korean terms, it is." I also put the question out there if South Korean President Park Geun-hye is moving democracy backwards from last week's podcast. A few people chose to chime in. Daniel Tudor said, yes. Twitter user HHMCD4 said, some peaceful dissent must be allowed in a democratic society like South Korea. Corey May said, all my coworkers say the exact same thing, that she is rewinding the clock on Korea and taking us back to the 1970s and 1980s. From last weekend's podcast on improving human rights in North Korea, Anime Only says, you can't do anything meaning with North Korea until you overthrow the government. Hey, you know what? I would like to extend my thanks to everyone who took the time out to send in their comments. I truly do appreciate it. And you know what? If you have a thought, if you have an opinion on any of the stories in this week's podcast or anything I share via social media, please, I'd love to hear from you. So write in, or you can also record yourself on your phone or on your computer and email in those audio files. Well, that is it for the podcast this week, and if you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends. And you know what? If you haven't subscribed, do so. It's free and easy to do, and when you do so, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or inside your favorite podcast application. You can keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter, and of course, if you have any comments, any questions, or any feedback, be sure to drop me a line. The email address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Steve Miller, and until next time, be true to yourself and always be awesome.